Good evening and welcome to this evening's Sagan National Colloquium event. My name is Lori Anderson and I'm a professor of botany and microbiology here at Ohio Wesleyan, and I'm co-director of the 2013 Sagan National Colloquium along with my colleague, Associate Professor Craig Jackson in the Department of Mathematics and Computer Sciences. I'd like to remind you to silence your cell phones as a courtesy to your fellow audience members and to our speaker. Now I'd like to begin with a short history of the Sagan National Colloquium, and then I'll introduce this evening's speaker. Established in 1984 and endowed by 1948 Ohio Wesleyan alumni John and Margaret Sagan in 1999, Ohio Wesleyan University's Sagan National Colloquium annually explores an issue of enduring and powerful social concern from multiple educational angles. This year, the theme of the Sagan National Colloquium is interdisciplinary impacts of climate change, and we have heard a diverse range of perspectives on this topic from distinguished artists, authors, and scholars throughout the semester. One theme that has emerged in many of the presentations is that while climate science has many areas that require further investigation, there are areas of significant consensus within the scientific community, and responding to climate change is now more an issue of human perception and behavior than of scientific uncertainty. This evening's speaker, Dr. Anthony Leiserowitz, is an expert on American and international public opinion on global warming, including public perception of climate change risks, support and opposition for climate policies, and willingness to make individual behavioral change. Dr. Leiserowitz received his bachelor's degree in international relations from Michigan State University, his master's of science degree in environmental studies, and his doctoral degree in environmental science, studies, and policy from the University of Oregon. He is currently a research scientist and director of the Yale Project on Climate Change at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale University. He is also a principal investigator at the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions at Columbia University. He's conducted research at scales ranging from the global to the local, including work in the international arena, the United States, individual states such as Alaska and Florida, municipalities such as New York City, and with Eskimos in Northwest Alaska. His work has resulted in over 40 publications. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leiserowitz.
Thank you. Is that off? Great. Thank you. Well, can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you very much, both to Lori and Craig, for inviting me to come. It's really been a pleasure getting to know the campus and getting to know some of the faculty. You've had a tremendous, just a tremendous series here. I wish I could have been a student and been here the entire time, because you've had a real treat of great speakers, and you're going to have more next week. So I'll do what I can to uphold my end of the bargain. So let me give you a little more background about who we are and what we do at the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. We're really interested in understanding what do publics around the world understand and misunderstand about the causes, the consequences, and the potential solutions to climate change. How do they perceive the risks? So the likelihood and the severity of specific impacts, fires, floods, storm surge, etc. What kinds of policies do they support or oppose? And what kinds of behaviors are the public engaged in, willing to engage in? What barriers prevent them from changing behavior when it comes to climate and energy? And we look at behavior on lots of different levels, how people use energy at home and on the road, consumer behavior, will people support or purchase products and services that will lower their own carbon footprint? Will they reward and punish companies for their actions on climate change? We look at how we talk about this issue. How do we communicate about it with our friends, with our family members, with our coworkers? As well as social norms, these unwritten cultural rules that guide so much of our daily lives. And just one obvious example we've all largely lived through, and that's the shift in smoking. When I grew up, smoking was cool and glamorous, and it is not cool and glamorous in the same way anymore. And then last but not least, we look at political behavior, and not just do people support policy or not, but are they willing to vote for one political leader versus another? And even more importantly, we're spending a lot of time these days looking at to what extent will people actually become active citizens, to be mobilized, to demand that the political system change. And then as scientists, our ultimate question then is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, political reasons why some people get really engaged with this issue, other people are apathetic, and other people are downright dismissive? And then, as Lori mentioned, we look at these questions at many different scales. So I'll talk today mostly about what's going on here in the United States. We've done over a dozen national scale studies. We've been working at the state level. In fact, we just a couple months ago did a survey of Ohio, and I'll share some of those results with you. But we also work at increasingly internationally. We just did the first ever national study in China, the first ever national study in India, and then we've been working with the Gallup World Poll to actually look at how this issue plays in about 120 countries around the world. So I'm not going to talk about the international or the lower level stuff too much, but I'm more than happy in the question and answer period to go to those levels if people are interested. Okay, so here's what I'm mostly going to talk about. And much of our work, again, has been at the national scale. We actually are just about to do another survey. It's literally going in the field today. So we'll have much more recent results than what we have here, but this is just a few months ago in April. I'm also going to show you trends, because we've been doing 2 national surveys a year since 2008, and I've even been doing surveys as far back as 2000. But again, like I just mentioned, we have just done this state-level survey here in Ohio, and I'll talk about that. Okay, so what's going on? What are the long-term trends in Americans' responses to this issue, and what's going on behind the surface? So what I'm showing you here is all the different survey organizations that have repeatedly used the same question that is a different variant of the question, is global warming happening? Okay, so here's Gallup and us and Brookings and Pew and Stanford, and a number of different organizations use this particular question. We all ask the question in different ways, and thus you get different estimates. But that's not what I want you to look at. What I want you to look at is the trends, okay? And what we see in all of them is that back in about 2007, climate change reached a high water mark in public engagement, okay? And there was a lot going on in that time period of 2004, 5, 6, and 7. You had The Day After Tomorrow, big Hollywood blockbuster movie, which I actually did a national study on. Turns out it influenced public opinion, okay? Movies are powerful. But you also had Inconvenient Truth. You had the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change releasing a major report in 2007. You had the Academy Awards. You had the Nobel Prizes. You had Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of thumbing his nose at the Bush administration. Lots of things was happening back in 2006 and 2007, and that's when public engagement kind of crested. But then it dropped, and it dropped pretty dramatically, on average about 14 percentage points. Okay? Belief that climate change is happening dropped 14 percentage points from here down to bottoming out in about 2010. And since then, it's been coming back up. Not back up to where it was in 2007, but coming back. And just to put this into context, here's where Ohio was as of just a couple months ago. So guess what? Ohio, swing state, bam, right on the American average. Okay, but we see this in other data as well. So here's the question. If global warming is happening, do you think it is human caused, mostly natural caused, or we also allow people to say both, and so on? And what we've consistently seen is, again, first of all, that big drop from 2008 to 2010. But since then, it's been pretty consistent. Right about half of the country understands that this is mostly human caused. Okay? So there's still a great deal of misunderstanding out there about that basic scientific fact. But moreover, we find that only 4 out of 10 Americans understands that most scientists agree that climate change is happening. Okay, now note, this question does not ask, do the scientists agree that it's human caused? It's not asking, do the scientists agree that it's a serious problem? Or any of that. It's just simply asking, do most scientists think global warming is happening? Has the world been warming? about which there is no controversy. Even those scientists that doubt the human causation or doubt that it will be a serious problem don't deny the fact that the world has warmed over the past 50 and 100 years. Okay? And yet only 4 out of 10 Americans understand this fact. And in fact, when we ask people to estimate using quintiles, what proportion of climate scientists, the experts, believe that climate change is happening? Is it 0 to 10 or 0 to 20%, 20 to 40%, 40 to 60%, and so on? Only 13% of Americans get the correct answer, which is 80 to 100%. Best estimates is that it's over 97%. Okay? Now, this is a hugely important and consequential misunderstanding. We've identified this in our work, what we call this a gateway belief. Because the more people understand that the scientists agree, the experts agree about the reality of this problem, the more they themselves say, okay, I think it's happening. I think it's human caused. I think it's a serious problem. And in turn, they become more supportive of climate policy. And that makes perfect sense. If you're a layperson, you don't know much about climate change. I'm a person who's been studying climate change for 25 years, but you ask me to assess the risks of nanotechnology? I don't know. I kind of have to rely on the experts as well. And most people take the attitude of, look, if my perception is that the experts are still arguing with themselves over whether this is even happening, why would I take it that seriously? I'll let them figure it out. When they do, they'll let me know, and then I'll take it seriously. Okay? So we've actually done a number of messaging experiments and so on this exact point, and we find that the more people understand this, the more engaged they start to become. It's not a silver bullet by any means, but it's an important part of the puzzle. Okay, and likewise what we saw is not only that drop again, but we consistently have found that very few Americans are very worried about this issue. Okay, and as of April, it was 14% of Americans. Ohio, again, right on the average, 14% of Ohioans are very worried about climate change. Now, why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons, but one of the most important and consistent that we've seen through all the years of our work is that for many people, they think of climate change as a distant problem. That it's distant in time, the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and it's distant in space. It's about polar bears or small island countries. It's not about the United States. It's not about my state. It's not about my city. It's not about my friends and my family or the people and places that I care about. It's distant. It's far away. And so maybe even if I accept it, I don't see it as a high priority. And in fact, that's exactly what we see when we look at people's priorities. So this data is from Pew. It's from last spring. And what we've got here is at the very bottom of the list of public priorities that they measure is global warming, and that's where it always is. It's always at the absolute bottom. Okay, as of April, only 28% of Americans said that that was a high priority, and moreover, since 2007, that high water mark has dropped 10 points. The environment in that same time period dropped 5 points, energy dropped 12 points, but look what's now at the top: economy, jobs, deficits. Okay, shouldn't be surprising because that's what we talk about a lot. Okay, so we have another way that we get at this, and it's one of my favorite techniques, and I won't go into the underlying psychology, but since this is Ohio, so I have a completely representative sample of the American public sitting right here. So let's all play along. So here's the question, and I ask this in all of our surveys. What's the first thought or image that comes to mind when I say the words global warming? Now don't say anything. Okay. Now just out of curiosity, how many people had something come to their minds about melting ice? You know, ice shelves breaking off Antarctica. Get them up high. Get them up high. Okay. Sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. Yeah, look at that. It happens every time. And it actually works with an audience of climate scientists. Okay? And that's exactly what we find. When we code those responses, we find that the first thing most people think of is melting ice. Okay? Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, especially when the media reports this issue, you know, how do you represent climate change or global warming? Well, one of the first things they do is they go to the stock footage of those wonderful before and after photos of glaciers melting around the world, or ice dripping, and glaciers calving. Oh, that's good television. Big chunk of ice crashing into the water. Good pictures, good television, and yet that's exactly what most people think of. And that's really helpful in an important way, because it does help people understand that this is real, because it resonates with an underlying mental model that we have all built up through many, many years of experience. Okay? We all know that if we take a glass of ice outside on a hot day, what happens? It melts, right? We all know that. So when you show people pictures of melting ice around the world, they go, okay, that makes sense to me. That resonates. Okay? But there's also a problem with this particular image. Okay? All those people that were thinking of melting ice, can you put your hands back up, please? Up high, way up high, way up high. Now I want you to keep your hand up if you live in Antarctica, or next to the Arctic Ocean, or next to a melting glacier. Really? Nobody? Nobody? Okay, it's distant. It reinforces the sense that this is happening far away. It's happening at the poles. It's happening on the top of mountains. Okay? There's rarely any people in those pictures of that melting ice. Okay? So yeah, it's happening, but most people aren't connecting the further dots. They do get A, warming causes B, melting. All right. But they don't get A, warming causes B, melting causes C, sea levels to rise, especially as the land ice melts, which causes D, more coastal erosion and flooding along our coastlines. And what they really don't get is A, warming causes B, melting, which causes C, changes in the Earth's reflectivity, known as albedo, the whiteness of snow and ice, which reflects sunlight back into outer space, keeping the planet cooler. When all that ice and snow melts, it's exposing dark earth and water, which now absorbs all that heat, which increases the temperature warming, which increases the melting, which increases the warming, which increases the melting in a runaway feedback cycle. Okay? The death spiral of what's happening in the Arctic. That's the kind of phenomenon that most climate scientists are actually the most worried about, but most people don't actually think of or understand when they think about ice melting and climate change. Then come a number of associations to just heat. We say global warming. People go, oh, temperature's going up. So pretty straightforward. Then a lot of people who confuse it with the ozone hole. Okay? We find this consistently. Many Americans think that global warming and the ozone hole are either the same thing, or that the ozone hole actually causes global warming. Okay? And there's a longer story there. If someone wants to ask me that in the Q&A, I'll be happy to do it, but I won't do it right now. Then there are people we call alarmists. These are people who provide apocalyptic visions of what global warming is going to bring, like death of the planet, all life dead, like after a nuclear war, that kind of stuff. Often in response to go way beyond the worst case scientific projections. I mean, this is a serious problem. It's not going to wipe out all life on the planet. It might take out a number of species, it might even take out our own, but it's not the death of the planet. Then those that think of flooding as sea level rise, then changes in the seasons and overall climate patterns, impacts on non-human nature, not people. And then last but not least are those that we call naysayers. And these are people, and note that all this data, by the way, is from 2003. I'll show you more recent data in just a moment. The naysayers generally have 6 different responses. Those that just simply, it's not happening, just flat denial. Those that say, well, it might be happening, but I don't think the scientific evidence shows it yet. So they're grappling with evidence, they're just not convinced. Then there are those that doubt based on their own personal experience. Global warming, we had a freezing temperature, last night, so therefore there's no warming. Then there are those that blame it on environmentalists or media hype. And then last not least are those that we lovingly call conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's the United Nations trying to take away American sovereignty, it's Al Gore and his friends trying to get rich, and many, many, many other variants of those kinds of stories. Okay, so here are all the different kinds of things that we consistently see. And one of the most important things that we find, by the way, is what we never find. In all the years we ask this, nobody associates climate change with impacts on human health. Nobody. Nobody says anything about infectious diseases. Nobody says anything about asthma or allergies. Nobody says anything about the impacts of extreme weather events on human health. Okay? And yet we found in a lot of our other research that when you suddenly help people understand that, wait a second, this isn't just an environmental problem, this is actually a human health problem, that suddenly people go, oh, you mean it's not about just polar bears? Okay? And suddenly many people get much more engaged. Okay, so here's where we were in 2003. Here's where we were in 2010. Okay. Now, clearly, there's one category that has dramatically changed in that time period, and it's this one. And about half of those by 2010 were what we would call conspiracy theory type responses. Okay? So the broader cultural, political climate had radically shifted in that same time period. So what was going on? What was behind all of those declines I've been showing you? Well, we're actually very actively investigating that right now with our data, but what we do know is that there was this kind of perfect storm of a whole bunch of events that all happened at the exact same time. First, the economy. The economy, the economy, the economy. 2008 is when the housing bubble pops and the financial crisis hits and unemployment surges up over 10%. And of course people are freaked out about that. They should have been freaked about that. And the economy and unemployment soar to the top of public priorities where they have dwarfed everything else ever since. But what many people don't recognize is that there was also a major shift in media coverage. My colleague Max Boykoff tracks newspaper coverage. Newspaper coverage dropped by 2/3. Okay? My colleague Bob Brule tracks nightly network news coverage, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, etc. It dropped 90%. Okay? And by the way, that's off a baseline of almost 0. Even back in 2007, climate change, we've just actually submitted a paper on this, climate change in 2007 compared to all the other news that was reported in that year got 0.1%. No, I'm sorry, wrong. In that year, that was a good year. It was 0.8%. Okay? In 2011, it got 0.1%. Okay? Now, this is an issue. You know, look, you've got beautiful windows here. We can look out these windows, and there is CO2 pouring out of buildings. It's pouring out of smokestacks. It's pouring out of tailpipes. In fact, it's pouring out of your mouth and nose this very second. But until I mentioned that, you weren't ever conscious of it. Okay? Why? Because it's invisible. The primary cause of climate change, which is carbon dioxide, is not visible to most of us, even though we are surrounded by it every day. If carbon dioxide was black and you were walking through it every day, I guarantee you we would have solved this problem a long time ago. Especially if it was like a really nasty color of fuchsia or something like that, that made people sick. Okay? Moreover, the impacts are largely invisible, unless you know where to look. And really, the only way most Americans know about this issue is from the media. Okay? We don't know scientists personally. We don't read the peer-reviewed literature. We don't read the IPCC reports. Okay? The only way we know about it is through what we learn about it primarily from the media. And when the media doesn't report it, it's literally out of sight and out of mind. Doesn't mean people have completely forgotten about it. It's just not salient. It's just not a priority. Okay, we also had some unusual cold weather. 2009, I always get these backwards. 2009 was Snowmageddon, and then 2010 was Snowpocalypse. Okay, and we're running out of these big names for snowstorms. And like I said, for those people, especially that are kind of in the middle and making up their mind, we know they draw on personal experience to try to make up their mind about whether global warming is happening. They go through a really hot heat wave, they suddenly go, oh yeah, that seems like global warming. They go through a big snowstorm, they go, well, that doesn't seem like global warming, so maybe not. Okay, so some people will shift based on recent experience of the weather. There was also, and we have to give credit where it's due, an effective denial industry. Very well documented, very well established, been operating for many decades, and pretty effective, especially in this time period, because there was real comprehensive climate policy going through Congress at this moment. was the first time that there was comprehensive climate legislation about to be considered, supported by the president, passed by the House, and was being debated by the Senate. There were real stakes on the line. And this community went into overdrive to try to stop it because they're perfectly happy with the status quo. Okay? We also had ClimateGate, this stolen tranche of emails from climate scientists taken off the University of East Anglia server, which, when taken out of context, looked bad, looked like scientists were making up data as the denial sphere went on with. And what we found is in our own research that media coverage led to about 12% of Americans becoming less convinced that climate change is happening, and moreover, less trustful of scientists. Okay? Now, importantly, however, that effect was not universally spread throughout American society. It was highly concentrated among people who tended to be conservative, Republican, and to get their news and information from Fox News and Rush. Okay? And then we went back and we look at how the different sources actually covered this issue. And yes, the CBS Evening News reported on it once or twice, but it was Fox and Rush where this stuff where the story got repeated again and again and again and again, and always with this very sinister interpretation of a cover-up. Okay, and then the other thing we have to recognize is that there's just been increasing political polarization that really took off in this time period, though it's been happening ever since 1997. Believe it or not, in 1997, Democrats and Republicans were really almost identical on this issue. They all supported action. But since then, the two parties have gotten farther and farther and farther and farther and farther apart. I mean, and yet it's astonishing. I mean, just remember, 2008, not even that long ago, the Republican nominee for president was John McCain, who had single-handedly been the primary champion of climate legislation in the US Senate for about a decade. Okay? A true leader. He was the nominee of the Republican Party, and yet 4 years later, almost every single Republican running for candidate, with the one exception of John Huntsman, either said climate change is not a problem, or more extremely said it's a hoax. Okay? So the Republican Party in particular shifted dramatically, changing the political climate of climate change. But at the same time, since 2011, we've seen public engagement starting to come back. So why is that? Well, again, the economy and employment are improving, so we're not quite as worried about this as we used to be. There has been increasing media coverage in the past 2 years, and in large part that's because we've gone through two record-setting years, 2011 and 2012. 2011 had 14 individual extreme weather disasters that each cost at least $1 billion. Okay. Followed up by 2012, which was second only to 2011, and really went out with a bang with Hurricane Sandy at the end. And what we know is that many Americans are beginning to connect the dots. So we ask the question, and we find that a majority of Americans, as of just last April, 60%, think that global warming is already affecting weather in the United States. And moreover, they say that it's even making specific extreme weather events more severe. So about half of the country thinks that global warming was a contributing factor to 2012 being the warmest year on record, the drought that was still gripping the Midwest and Great Plains, Superstorm Sandy, even the major snowstorm that hit us on the East Coast right around that time. Now, what we also know is that about 8 out of 10 Americans say they have personally experienced one or more of these disasters in the past couple of years. And about a third of them say that they've been personally harmed in some form or fashion from those events. And what we say, or what I would argue, is that there's nothing inherent in these extreme events that suddenly convinces somebody that climate change is real. I mean, it can happen, but I think what these really present are teachable moments. They're one of the rare times in American life, and especially in American media, when we are focused on something that has direct links to climate change. Okay? Unlike the latest celebrity scandal, unlike the goings-on in Washington, unlike what's going on in other countries, This is one of the rare moments when Americans actually start asking the question. And what we are finding is that many people, well, there's an old saying, if it happens once, it's happenstance. If something happens twice, it's a coincidence. If it happens 3 times, you're beginning to see a pattern. And if it happens 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 20, 22, 24 times, many people start connecting the dots between each of these record-setting events and saying, what is going on? Is something really strange happening with the weather? And again, it just opens the opportunity to engage people in the discussion. Okay, so all of that's happening, but at the same time, there's still long-standing support for a lot of the policies. Now, not a priority, but nonetheless support for a number of policies. And here, this is the data from Ohio, which is, again, very consistent with what we see nationally. And so the question is, do you think each of the following should be doing much more, less, or much less to address global warming, or do you think they're currently doing the right amount? And what we consistently see is that people want more action from business, from corporations, but they don't let themselves off the hook. They're second. The citizens themselves need to be part of this. But here's Ohio state legislators, well over 50%. Here's Obama, your governor, and local government officials, all expected to be taking action as well. And note that the people who say they should be doing much more are often 2 to 3, even 4 times more than those that are strongly opposed. Okay. And we see, again, that there's still long-standing support for a number of other related policies. I'm back now to the national level. You know, providing tax rebates for people who purchase energy-efficient vehicles or solar panels. People like that. Funding more research into renewable energy. Regulating CO2 as a pollutant. That actually is the main policy under debate right now, because that's the one thing Obama can actually do by himself without Congress, is actually have the EPA regulate emissions from power plants. A carbon tax on fossil fuel companies if the money is used to pay down the national debt. Turns out Americans will actually support, I mean, and believe me, I had been asking carbon tax questions for years and just finding consistently, like, Americans have this antibody, anaphylactic shock reaction to the word tax, right? But it turns out that when you make the tax revenue neutral, that suddenly you can actually get people about 50% or more to support it. And I think what we're actually tapping into is this basic distrust, deep distrust of Washington and of government. Okay? It's not necessarily that they just inherently hate taxes, though there are certainly Americans who do, but many are just, I don't trust those folks. So if I know the money is not going to go into their coffers and that they can't actually use it for their own purposes, then I might actually support it. Eliminating all subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. A majority of Americans support that. They, however, do not support eliminating subsidies for the renewable energy industry. People want those because they do believe and they do want this clean energy future. Requiring utilities to produce 20% electricity from renewables, even if it costs the average household an extra $100 a year. You know, less support, but still consistently over half. Okay. But perhaps even more importantly is when we bring it down to the local level. We say the federal government is encouraging communities to prepare for the impacts of global warming so that people and property are protected. How important do you think it is for your community to take steps to protect the following from global warming? And suddenly we find that everybody likes this idea. Okay? This includes Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. Okay? And overwhelmingly, 80+%. Now, there's a much bigger conversation to be had there about the fact that I think there's actually was a major strategic mistake by the climate community to start by talking about global climate change, not local climate change. Most Americans are very local. Let me give you one indication of that. Where do most people get their news and information from? Turns out it's not the New York Times, it's not the Washington Post, it's not the CBS Evening News, it's not Fox News. It's local television news, local TV. Most people live in local communities. That's where their attention is, that's where their primary focus is, that's where their lives are, that's where they care about. Okay? all too many Americans can't identify a rock on a map. Okay? And yet, as a community, especially of scientists, we started by basically parachuting into these communities and saying, let us tell you about this problem. It's called global climate change. And by the way, it's abstract, it's invisible, it's very complicated. We're going to throw a lot of jargon at you and numbers that you don't understand. And we're basically going to talk to you in a language you've never heard before about something that doesn't inherently interest you or motivate you. Okay? What we're in fact finding all over the country is that when you instead start the conversation locally, you get people's attention. Because it's about their lives. It's about it's relevant. And if you start the question with, how are we vulnerable here? How are we contributing to the problem here? And moreover, if we had to try to prepare for and adapt to the changes that we're already all experiencing, I mean, Americans are already seeing how vulnerable our systems are to the extreme weather we've already experienced. And you say, okay, this is how hard it is now. What would it be like at a 2-degree world? What would it be like in a 3-degree world? What's it going to be like in a 4-degree world? And our experience is that people, as soon as they start really grappling with that, they suddenly get really, really interested in mitigation. Basically, the wonderful old Benjamin Franklin concept that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That we can't just adapt our way out of these at these higher levels of global climate change. Okay, another major thing that we've learned along the way is that there is no such thing as the American public. We talk about it all the time. If I had a dime for every time I've heard a congressman say, the American people want what I want, right? But it's not true. Certainly not true for climate change or any other important issue. And in our work, we've identified what we call global warming's 6 Americas. That when we look at their beliefs, their risk perceptions, their policy preferences, and their behaviors, we've actually identified 6 very different Americas within the United States that each respond to this very differently. So the first is a group we call the alarmed, that's 16%. These are people who think it's happening, it's human-caused, it's serious, it's urgent. They're ready to go, but they keep asking, what can I do? What can we do? Because they don't know. And again, this is a failure of the climate community. We have done a far better job of explaining the threat to people than we have what we do about it. Secondly, as a group we call the concerned. These are people who think it's happening and human-caused and serious, but again, distant. Distant in time, distant in space, so not a high priority. I'd support somebody doing something about it, but it's not motivating me much. Then a group we call the cautious. It's kind of still on the fence, making up their mind. Is it happening? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it serious? Is it kind of overblown? Paying attention, haven't really made up their mind. Then a group we call the disengaged, small, 5%, but have heard the term global warming, but don't know anything about it. Over and over. I don't know what causes it. I don't know what the impacts are going to be. I certainly don't know what the solutions are. Pretty checked out. Then a group we call the doubtful. These are people who say, I don't think it's happening. But if it is, it's natural. Nothing humans had anything to do with. Nothing we can do anything about. So I don't see it as much of a risk, and I don't pay much attention. And then last but not least, those we call the dismissive, who are firmly convinced it's not happening, it's not human-caused, it's not serious. And again, many of them are conspiracy theorists. Now note, that's 13%. Let me say that again. That's 13%. But they're a really loud 13%. They're a really vocal 13%. They're a relatively organized 13%. Okay? When we actually go and look at the comments section on any article on climate change, say in USA Today, you've all seen this. You know, you go look at the comment sections, and half or more of them will be from people in this perspective. Okay? They basically are filling the public square and giving many people, lay people, journalists, and policymakers, the false impression that half or more of the country doesn't believe climate change is even real. In fact, think it's a hoax. But it's not true. They're just really good at communicating. All right, just to make the point then that these groups that we have completely different conversations happening in this country at the same time, we asked Americans, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, what question would you ask? Well, the doubtful and dismissive, their primary question is, how do you know that global warming is happening and human caused? And on a deeper level, why should we trust you? Then the groups in the middle are saying, okay, maybe it's happening, but so what? Why should I care? Whereas these groups are, okay, I'm with you, it's happening, it's human caused, but what do we do? What do we do? And what we're beginning to hear, just some initial glimmers of, is actually another question, which is it too late? And that's a really dangerous belief. Because if you think it's too late and that we can't do anything, then it is too late. Henry Ford once beautifully said, those who think they can and those who think they can't are both right. Okay, one other point I want to make about these is how then this plays into values, because values turn out to be hugely important in shaping the way we respond. So here are those 6 Americas, and we look at this particular policy item, regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. And they line up exactly how you would expect. The alarmed overwhelmingly support this, the dismissive hate this policy. Same with a requirement of a 20% national renewable portfolio standard, that 20% of all electricity has to be generated from wind and solar and so forth. The alarmed, all for it. Dismissive, I hate that idea. Okay? But by contrast, you look at support from renewable energy research, and everybody supports that. Government support for people buying more fuel-efficient vehicles and solar panels, everybody supports that. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out that one of the best predictors of people's views of this are their underlying values. People who are alarmed and concerned tend to have what we call egalitarian values. They care strongly about affirmative action, getting rid of poverty, they're worried about the great and growing inequities of wealth around the world, and so on and so forth. Nothing to do with climate change per se, and yet those people with those values care a lot about climate change. But by contrast, those people who have what we call a deeply individualistic worldview, that say it's all about essentially my individual liberty, my individual freedom, and it often gets expressed as anti-government because government's too big, it's too intrusive, it's too much regulation, too much taxation, etc. They're deeply hostile to the issue of climate change. Okay? So it's important to recognize that actually the alarmed and the dismissive are both afraid. They both have the same emotion. The alarmed are afraid of climate change, the impacts that climate change is going to have. The dismissive are also afraid of climate change, but what they're really afraid of is climate policy. That if you really accept this problem, it is the ultimate collective action problem. We cannot just individually, through voluntary action, solve climate change. There's no way the world is going to solve it that way. It's going to take collective action of some kind, and that's going to involve at least some element of governance. And yet, all of them will support this kind of thing. Okay? Why is that? Because this happens to be a policy that everybody can see their own values in. Okay? The alarmed and concerned, they support this policy because they care about climate change, and they know that clean energy is one of the ways we're going to solve it. The doubtful and dismissive, they don't believe in climate change. So why do they support this? Okay? Because for them it's about increasing our independence, especially our energy independence, our freedom and our self-reliance, which is also what's going on here with solar panels. Okay? And I got to tell you, as somebody who lost power for 10 days in Hurricane Irene a couple years ago, I would have killed for my own solar panels. Okay? I don't like being dependent on a big centralized monopoly. And let me give you just one concrete example of something that just happened, amazing, a couple months ago in Georgia. The Sierra Club teamed up with the Georgia Tea Party. Let me say that again. The Sierra Club teamed up with the local Tea Party to fight the, I forget the name of it, it's Georgia Power, I think, which is a monopoly. Okay? One utility basically controls all energy production and distribution in Georgia. And they teamed up because they wanted to force a change in the regulation to allow people to put solar panels on their roofs and sell the power back into the grid. Guess what? The monopoly didn't want that. Right? They're perfectly happy with their profits the way they are. Okay? So those two groups joined forces and actually successfully got the regulation changed. And you know what they're calling themselves? Wait for it. The Green Tea Party. Okay? That's the art of politics. Finding strange bedfellows. Okay? Or another way of saying is there are many roads to Damascus. Of how do you get very different types of people to agree on the exact same policy, but for completely different reasons? It's not like the Sierra Club and the Tea Party suddenly said, oh, we love each other. Because when it comes to other issues like, say, nuclear power, the Tea Party is all for building a nuclear power plant in Georgia, and the Sierra Club is completely against it. So it's not like they suddenly, fixed everything. But there were these particular things that they could actually reach common ground on. All right, last thing I'm going to talk about is political activism. So in April, we asked this question: would you be willing to join a campaign to convince elected officials to do the right thing about global warming? And what we find is that about anywhere from 17 to 82 million in just these two categories say that they would be willing to do that. Okay, so let's just throw out all these people, because they only somewhat agree, so they're just saying it. It's a survey, so we don't count them. That's still 17 million people in just these two boxes right there. Okay, 17 million. Now, to put that number in perspective, let me ask this question. Now, we have a country of 240 million adults, and you know the power and the influence that the Tea Party has had on our politics in recent years. How many people are members of the organized Tea Party? I mean, and I don't mean sympathizers, I mean they go to meetings all over, in chapters, in communities and towns and states all over America. What would you guess? How many people are there that are part of those organizations? Anyone guess? 240 million American adults. 3 million. Do I hear 4 million? What do you think? 50,000. All right, 200,000. 200,000. 200,000 people that were organized. They were well funded. They took advantage of an infrastructure, a conservative infrastructure that has been built up methodically for decades. All true. Okay? But there's 17 million people in these two boxes right there. And so then we've asked, so, what would you do in terms of political action? And we find, of course, people say they're much more likely to sign a petition than they are to go do these other things, but there's still a lot of people. Let's just take this number right here, that 4%, that would actually write a letter, email, or phone a government official about global warming. That's not even like knocking on their door, right? That's not like going and confronting them face to face and saying, what are you going to do for me on climate change? This is just sending a letter, an email, or a phone number. That's 10 million adults. Okay? If 2 million adults actually did this, it would be a radical signal in the political system. Okay, so who can convince Americans to take action to reduce global warming? This is, I thought, very interesting, because what we find is that it's overwhelmingly the people who are closest to us. It's not Twitter, it's not Facebook, it's not President Obama, it's not a religious leader or some distant other. It's the people in our own social networks. Okay? It's my best friend. It's my wife. It's my kid. Okay? That's who mostly can influence us. Okay? And that's the easiest thing to do, is to just talk about it, because we don't right now. We just don't talk about it. And as a result, it's not salient, it's not a priority. Okay? And yet, how hard is that? I'm not talking about having a deep conversation with your Uncle Bob at the Thanksgiving Day table who's an ardent denier and that you're going to somehow try to convince him. That's a hard ask. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about your best friend. Okay. So as I've described, we saw a major shift in public understanding of this and engagement with this issue from 2008 to 2010, and it changed the national political climate. Okay, where even the president and members of Congress wouldn't utter the words climate change. So that is now starting to change. There is still majority public support for a variety of policies, including especially at the state and local levels. There are these 6 different Americas, and you need to know who your audience is. It's one of the first rules of an effective communication or education. Know who your audience is. Don't assume that they're going to be motivated by the same thing that motivated you. Okay, that's been a consistent mistake, especially by environmentalists, who basically come in and say, and I'm being unfair, but I'm going to be simplistic and say, you know, what motivated me on this was what's happening to the polar bears. Oh, what's happening to the polar bears? Okay, great. But that's not most people. Most people don't really care that much about polar bears. Okay? Or actually think, you know what, if a polar bear saw you, it would eat you. Okay? So don't assume that that's the same argument that's going to work with somebody else. Critically, the facts are actively interpreted by these different audiences who are always constructing their own understanding in accordance with what they know or think they know, their underlying values, and their feelings. This is an issue that's already bringing up really important and difficult feelings for people. Okay? I'm not even talking about the hostility of the dismissive as an example, which again is only 13%. That's a relatively rare thing you're going to encounter. I'm talking about the existential crisis this evokes. Really start to grok it. That really start to think about it. What does this mean for the future that we're barreling into? Okay? This is bringing up really difficult questions of fear and what's our future going to be like for ourselves and for our kids. And we have to accept that. That is part of the process. We have to talk about how this makes us feel. If you can't do that, then you're ignoring what's really at the root of much of this problem. Knowledge is necessary. You know, knowledge does matter. That's why we come to universities. But it's insufficient. That emotions, values, ideology, and these broader social, political, and economic forces are all playing critical roles in the way that we respond to an issue like this too. Okay? And then in terms of some strategies, well, one thing we need to do is we need to recognize that in fact the experts are in complete agreement on the nature of the basic problem. Yeah, there's lots of debate about, you know, when might there be a drought in the year 2030 in Africa. Oh my God, that's an incredibly difficult problem from a scientific standpoint. There is no serious debate about the basics, that it's real, that it's us, that it's bad now and it's going to get worse. And yet that there are solutions, that there are things we can do. Crucial to talk about the fact that there are things we can do. That it has human consequences, not just for polar bears. And then last but not least, the simplest, easiest step is to talk about it. It's that simple. Okay. Thank you very much. If you want to learn more about any of our stuff, we make it all available online. Come visit us. So I'm happy to take any questions if people would like.
Come to you with the microphone.
Okay.
Here.
Have attitudes about scientists being believable or not? Because when I was younger, it seemed like, ooh, the scientist said it, and now we scratch that out and say, I don't believe it.
Yeah, great question. We spent a lot of time asking that very question around trust. Who do you trust? And actually, the news is that people overwhelmingly trust scientists on this issue. Overwhelming. I mean, 80, 90% approval, essentially. I mean, things that, by comparison with their member of Congress or a journalist, I mean, it's like ridiculous, okay? So very, very high levels of trust, but the problem again is that most of us don't know scientists. We don't know scientists. I mean, there was actually a study done, I think just about a year ago, where people were asked to name a living scientist. And most people couldn't do it. And those people that guessed tended to answer Einstein or Darwin, okay? If only they were still alive, okay? So yes, we're trusted, but we're an abstract, distant other, which is why, again, I come back to the importance of the people we really trust who are in our lives. Those are really important messengers. I mean, if there's actually a very simple phrase, it's not a formula, but it's about as close to it as you can get, and that is that if you want to communicate effectively, use simple, clear messages, which is very hard for a scientist to do. Simple, clear messages, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated so many times that you can't stand to hear the words come out of your mouth anymore, and that's probably right about the time that they actually hear you, okay? By a variety of trusted sources. Okay? And so the key is, who are those trusted sources for the person or the class of people that you're trying to reach? So yes, scientists can do an awful lot of good validating, and scientists need to do a much better job of actually meeting the public more than halfway. But in the end, it's just a limited set of people in the scientific community, and they do have day jobs. And they should keep doing those day jobs. So in the end, it's on the rest of us to talk about it. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
What are those simple, clear things I should be telling my family and friends to do? You say it's not too late. Tell them what to do.
Sure.
Thanks.
Well, again, I'm going to throw it back to you and just say, who are your family and friends? Okay? And the answer to that may be different depending on who they are and what their experience is and what they're willing to do. My simplest answer to that is organize. It's not change your light bulbs. That's great. Change your light bulbs. Insulate your attic, please. The one thing that you can do, insulate your damn attic. Okay? Way more important than anything else. You know, inflate your tires, all that garbage, but that's not what's really going to do it in the end. This is going to take political change. Okay? I mean, some wonderful analyses have been done looking at if Americans all, you know, with very conservative estimates, nothing radical here, took common sense, even profitable energy efficiency measures, collectively we could reduce U.S. emissions by about 10%. And that's important. 10%. Okay? That's a key contribution of what's going to be a whole portfolio of things that has to be done. But it's only 10%. The other 90% is going to come from systemic changes. And the only way we're going to get those is through economics and policy. So, yes.
Yeah, actually two questions. One, the first thing that occurred to me was not polar bears, but extreme weather. And that's not even on your list of possibilities, and that's something that affects all of us all the time.
Oh, yeah, it's on there. Yeah, I've talked a lot about extreme weather.
Well, you talked about nature, but I think that's what you meant by nature, right? When you had that list of things people were responding in 2011 and 2008 or 2007.
Yeah, extreme weather.
Was not one of those things on that list.
It absolutely is one of those things on the list. But
I don't
anyway,
remember seeing
I'm not disagreeing with
Okay,
you.
so the other thing is I give a lot of talks about climate change. I am a scientist, so I know a scientist.
Yeah.
And the problem is that I'm speaking, if I go to Rotary or if I go give a science cafe or something, I'm actually speaking to all 6 Americas.
Uh-huh.
And so you said, well, tailor your message to whom you're speaking, but I'm speaking to everyone in some sense. What advice do you give me when I go to talk to everyone?
Yeah, no, that's the hard thing. And I think you need to decide who you really want to reach. Okay, so let me just put this out to you strategically. Take the 6 Americas as an example. You can probably assume, I'm assuming that you believe climate change is real and a serious problem and so on. Yeah, no, of course. But if that's your basic starting point, then you can already assume that the alarmed are with you. Okay? You're not convincing them. Now, you may want to inform them. You may want to give them more detail because they're an attentive and eager audience. So you may want to talk to them. But if your goal is to try to convince people, you've already got them. So don't tailor your message to them. The concerns, you pretty much got them already as well. Though the main thing that they want to know about is, well, why should this be a priority now? Okay? Can't we just put this off for 25 years or more? Okay? So that's the message that they want to know. But the group in the middle, in particular, the cautious, because you're probably not going to get any of the disengaged there, because they're not coming to your talk anyway. Right. But the cautious, they're coming because they actually still have questions. They actually still have an open mind. They tell us they want to know more. And for them, they actually are open to hearing at least some of the evidence if you present it in a simple, clear, and understandable way. And then you get to the doubtful, and some of them are actually still open. They are processing based on evidence. They happen to be hearing evidence, quote-unquote evidence, from specific sources that tell them that this isn't true or that it's nothing to worry about, and so on and so forth. But they are at least still processing. And then last is the dismissive, and you're not going to convince them, okay? You're just not in that context. It takes a very different kind of a context to have a constructive conversation with somebody like that. Not to say it's not worth doing, it is, but probably not in a public forum. So, yeah.
Could you talk what kind of organizing, and could you comment on Bill McKibben's organization at 365.org and what they've been doing? Have they succeeded in moving the needle any?
Yeah, so there's a number of organizations that are out there that are doing this now, and I think it totally depends on what you're particularly interested in. 350 has really taken off, especially on college campuses. It tends to be a younger movement, though not exclusively. And their particular angle has been much more in the vein of protest. You know, Keystone is a great case in point. The student divestment movement is a major campaign of Bill McKibben's 350 work as well. So very kind of confrontational. But another group out there that I actually have great respect for is called Citizens Climate Lobby. They're actually tend to be an older group, but they are based in pockets all over the country, and their basic strategy is that they are relentless lobbyists, okay? In other words, they train and they sharpen their message, so they then go and meet with editors, they go meet with journalists, and they go meet with their local and state and federal officials. And they keep coming back. Very polite. It's relentless politeness, okay? They keep coming, you know, Senator, what are you going to do for climate change? Senator, what's your plan on climate change? Senator, we just had a major flood in our district. What are you going to do about climate change? Again and again and again and again. Because like I said, well, let me just put it this way, because I do talk to a number of these elected officials, and I'll actually hear this message. Some of them will say, you know what, I actually think climate change is a serious problem, and I'd like to help. I'd like to do something on it. But the fact is that there's nobody in my face coming to my office saying, you need to act on climate change now. Nobody does that. But I've got a long line of people out my office door who are coming to my office and saying, you need to do this. You need to change the tax code. You need to work on the deficit. You need to get jobs. You need to do all these other things. And when that's your situation, what are you going to focus on? Okay? So I think that's one of the powers of this particular approach that Citizens Climate Lobby is taking, is to say there is actually a large constituency out there that does think this is a critical issue and does demand action. And I think until most elected officials see that, they're not even going to feel safe to take action, much less motivated to do it.
You mentioned that there's a lack of solutions to the global warming issue, that people, while tend to have much more information on global warming is happening and that it's real and it's a threat, there's very little scant information about what we should actually do about it.
Right.
Would you agree that a major point in that is scientists would have to first test the solutions to ensure that those aforementioned solutions do not, in fact, corrupt or negatively affect some other factors that they might not have checked? And that might have led to the lack of solutions, or rather the delay in solutions being reported, and explaining that to the general public that the solutions are in waiting or delayed because they are actually being considered and tested rather than not existent is important and would influence the society, that the scientists are trying to do something about it, but they want to be sure that what they do will not ruin something else.
Okay, so this is a big problem, no question about it. We're talking about shifting away from the primary energy source that modern civilization has been built on and that we all depend on, right? I mean, we all have a clear stake in this. Fossil fuels are in our clothes, it's in the food we eat, it's in the water we drink, I mean, in terms of getting it to us and bottling it and everything else. It's how we move around. I mean, this is a major shift. This is a major shift. The thing is, though, that it's going to take a lot of different things. There are no silver bullets. To actually quote Bill McKibben here, there's no silver bullet. We need silver buckshot, right? We need a lot of different things to happen. And there have been some great analyses that show what each of those are. But the good news is that a lot of the first steps that need to be done already exist. They already exist. They don't require any new technology. They don't require anything else. They are already on the shelf, and in fact, they're not even, they're even profitable. Okay, I would encourage you to go look at something called the McKinsey cost curve. McKinsey, a very famous business consulting company, was hired to do an analysis of what could America do to tackle its greenhouse gas reduction goals. And look at each of those policies and then see, would it cost us money, would it be neutral, or would we make money? And there's a whole long list of things that we actually can make money by doing the right thing, including in particular energy efficiency, our buildings, okay? Because everything you do, like insulating your attic, that is money right in your pocket within a relatively short payback period. It could be 3 years, 5 years. You're now making net surplus. So there's an awful lot of things we can do right here and now, but at the same time, we do need to be investing in continued research and new technologies that are going to ultimately allow us to get to where we need to go, which is at minimum a very low carbon society, if not an actually zero carbon society. And some dreamers even want to go to a net negative carbon economy. But there's lots of things that are out there to do, even right now.
I can speak loudly.
Sure.
Talk about the effect of age in your research.
Age?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've actually published a report on age, how different generations respond to this issue. And to be honest, contrary to what I hear from a lot of people in the environmental community, especially the older graybeards, they say it's the young people today who care about this issue. They're going to change it. I don't see it. I don't see it. What I'm saying, however, is that there may be thousands of young people flocking to this issue and taking it on college campuses, which I think is happening, but it's not happening at the generational level. It's not happening across the entire cohort of young Americans. It hasn't spread throughout the entire generation. So thus far, I have not seen in our data anything that suggests that 18 to 22-year-olds are really that different in a consistent way than the other generations. So you'll find those 6 Americas in every single generation. Every single generation. You also find them in every part of the country. Okay? They're in Lubbock, Texas. They're in San Francisco. They're in Columbus. Different proportions, but they're everywhere. Any other questions? Maybe one more? Oh, well, no, it's all right. She already had a question.
Sure. I'll use my teacher voice. Oh, okay. I also had, like the earlier question about the images and associations with climate change.
Yeah.
One of the things that, as a historian and a humanist, that I noticed right away is that no one seems to be linking it to the things that disturbed and upset so many people about, say, Katrina, with equality, injustice, human concerns, human issues. It all seems to be about the physical environment. Is there a way to bridge that communication?
There is. It's to help people understand that this is about people, that there are deep and profound issues of justice and fairness. But that said, even if you can do that effectively, you're ultimately only communicating to those Americans who already share a deeply egalitarian worldview. There are other Americans for whom that argument is going to be kind of like, okay? Especially when it seems like the solutions you're pushing are going to impinge upon my freedom. They're going to grow the government. Going to be more regulation, more taxes. You lost me. Okay? So it's complicated, but there's certainly an awful lot to be done for even those people who do care deeply about those issues of fairness and justice to help them understand that this isn't just about fairness and justice for other critters. There's a huge issues of fairness and justice for our fellow human beings. So, all right, thank you very much.
All right. If you have other questions, please come forward. And I'd also like to remind you, we have 2 other speakers to close out the Sagan National Colloquium on Climate Change next week. And I want to just mention as a special preview to this audience that next year, next fall, our Sagan National Colloquium will be on the topic of water, directed by Dr. Ellen Arnold, who asked one of the questions. So get excited for that. Thank you very much.